Hello, it's Cat Lancaster here, and I want to start by saying how terribly sorry I am for not being with you in person. Um, I had an unexpected event come up at the same time, amazingly, and I wasn't able to shift that. So you're stuck with me virtually, and I do really apologize for that, but I wanted to honor all the time and attention that you had spent in putting together the fabulous questions that you sent through and the scenarios that you sent through. So hopefully this will be not too poor second option. And obviously, if you have additional questions or things come up, as we're chatting, then you can feel free to send those through to Megan and Michelle. But before we get any further, I would like to start this with an acknowledgement of the land from which I'm presenting. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here in Nam, also known as Melbourne, and I pay my deepest respects to their elders past and present, and acknowledge the continued connection over thousands of years to this beautiful place, their care of this country and their connection and continuity of culture, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded. It is, was, and forever will be Aboriginal land. So thanks again for all the really fantastic questions that you sent through. I can see the journey that we're going to be going on together today. I'm going to try my best to answer the questions as we go. And yeah, if I don't get to them all, and hopefully we'll get a chance to chat a little bit more at another time. So we'll start with the question that was, when considering inattentive ADHD, what are the key differences in presentation between this and general disengagement? And since general disengagement is something we see a lot, particularly for dealing with adolescents, that's a really good question, and I can understand the challenge there. So let's start with a really quick refresh on ADHD inattentive type. So fundamentally, we're talking about the root cause sitting in the functioning of the brain, right? So one of the big differences here is that you're talking about, one of them is looking at kind of a behavioral response, while the other one is actually about a different wiring. So predominantly their frontal lobe functions differently, impacting their ability to regulate attention, impacting their working memory. And this is a big one. So you think of that like your jot pad, where you write down all the little things you need to remember while you're trying to do a task. That doesn't work so effectively for them. So it impacts things like, following multi-step directions or being able to sequence a task. Things like that. And of course, then also their executive functioning, which is problem solving, emotional regulation, etc., is impacted. So these features are chronic and they're pervasive. So we'll see them across all settings, even things they like, things they don't like. And for these kids, they often want to focus, particularly around certain things. They'll want to focus, they'll want to be able to do what they've been asked to do, but it's exhausting to sustain that attention, or they just can't actually do it. And so often these kids get labeled, have a history of getting labeled as like lazy or disorganized, or they're unmotivated, even if they're actually trying really hard. And if they've been getting that message, they're lazy, unmotivated, etc., then the capacity to keep trying can become more difficult. And so these kids, they're not going to shift gears without having really structured ongoing support. So the disengaged kid, it can look a bit different. I mean, it look a bit the same, and it's a really human thing to be disengaged. But clearly clearly for individuals who've experienced trauma, it can be a real protective mechanism. It's a way of stepping out, shutting down. Um, but for these kids, it is more situational and it's more emotional in nature. So it's caused generally by a lack of interest or boredom or a lack of perceived kind of importance or value in the thing that's being asked of them. There's kind of a disconnection, I guess, from the activity or from the environment. That can be relatively kind of consistent, but often with these kids, we'll see some variation. It might be the right person, like there's a particular staff member or parent or teacher who comes on and they suddenly spark in a slightly different way, or there's a particular activity that gets a different level of engagement. Or even sometimes a time of day, like there's a particular time of day where they're like things kind of shift on them. Sometimes it's at night. The dark can provide comfort. So, it can't be the opposite, obviously. But there's like something where you see a slightly different kid. Um, and while that might be like totally conscious on their part, it's important to recognize that this is actually more of a choice. It's a behavioral response that's developed and maybe been shaped over time rather than something that's hardwired into their brain. So telling the difference between this can be really tricky, and it takes time and observation. Obviously, knowing a little bit of the history of the young person can help. If there's no diagnosis in place, so you're really trying to kind of work that out, it can be important maybe to try like a really novel or highly stimulating activity, something that's like really hands-on and super fun. And the kid with inattentive ADHD, they're still going to struggle to sustain attention. They're going to struggle to follow those multi-step directions. They may get frustrated with themselves because they can't quite get it through. While the disengaged kid may come a little bit more alive for a brief period if the task is exciting or relevant enough. So like really going for a high interest thing just to see whether or not you can spark a difference in the way that they engage. Trialing reward or incentives can be another way to work on it, because without structure, you might get some short-term gain from a kid with ADHD, but if you don't actually have a plan in place longer term, the rewards aren't going to be enough. They'll use a lot of energy to get them, but after time, their brain will get too tired and it'll fall over, while the disengaged kid might actually keep responding just for reward if you've gone high value enough. And then the last thing, you could try to do is actually just play around with things like multi-step directions and seeing what happens. The kid with ADHD is likely to forget a step, get lost midway through. They're the kid who starts getting dressed but then gets distracted, so you find them sitting in their underwear, those sorts of things, versus the disengaged kid who might not try because they're disinterested, but if they do get motivated, they actually can recall the steps. So they might not do it in the moment, but then maybe later they'll go and complete a task that you ask them to do, and they're able to complete all the tasks in their own sequence, or another circumstance. And so that would show you the difference between those two things. So I hope that's helpful. So the next question was, someone said, I noticed a higher number of kids in care with ADHD. Is there a link? And to the person who asked that question, you're 100% spot on. It's not a straight line, but your observation is absolutely supported by research. However, like all things, it's not like completely straightforward. There's a bit of complexity in there. So we know that in a 2021 study in Australia, that kids in care were shown to be 3 to 4 times as high. And this was backed up by some studies in the US as well. The challenge can be that ADHD can mimic trauma. And so it's a little difficult sometimes to know, is it ADHD? Is it trauma, or is it combining? Because trauma impacts the brain in the same places, working memory, executive functioning, etc., that early childhood trauma does. And so trauma can mimic ADHD. So important to recognize that, but it is absolutely true that we see a much higher level of diagnosis in kids with ADHD and kids who have trauma. Next question is about the differences in how neurodivergent conditions can present in males versus females. And the short answer is, while it is the same condition, right? It's ADHD for both, it's ASD for both. It does manifest differently. And this is really because girls are a whole lot better at masking their symptoms. So it means looking past when you're supporting girls. So the question was, is supporting girls different than supporting boys. And you have to really look past the surface and you have to really look past the diagnosis to support girls because the challenges are similar, but they are much better at hiding them. And they're much better at kind of making sure people don't pay attention, I guess, to those. And some of that's because social expectations are different. It's much more accepting for boys to kind of act out or show disruptive behavior, while girls start to feel that pressure to fit in a lot earlier and feel a much higher sense of kind of blending in than often boys do. Coping strategies are really different. We know that males tend to use externalizing or acting out. Patterns of behavior to cope in situations. And while obviously this is kind of being very blunt, I guess leaning into some of those stereotypes, there is, evidence to suggest this, while girls are much more likely to internalize, to people please, to mask what's going on. So while boys might be seen as naughty and inattentive, girls are often seen as anxious or shy. So what does it mean in terms of the supports that you provide to them? So I'm going to break this down now. We're going to talk about the differences between ADHD and ASD because they're a little bit different here. So for girls, ADHD tends to look more like inattentive symptoms like daydreaming or being kind of internally distracted. As I said, they're more likely to mask. And so they might be overlooked because they're disruptive. They tend to be diagnosed much later than boys. We often don't see girls getting diagnosed until they're in later adolescence, and that's because actually boys are socially starting to catch up. So then when a girl, I guess, social patterns don't seem as different to their male peers and their female peers, that's when people start to ask questions. So some of the things which are really different, they often need more validation for effort, not just the outcome. So boys tend to be a little bit more outcome oriented. So as well as saying that's a great job, you appreciate this, I see how hard you're working to stay focused. Got to really watch for burnout with girls that are working so much harder than we often think to overcompensate for things that they recognize, and they need some support with the organization and perfectionism, I guess, as well as the impulsivity. A lot of girls with ADHD are seen as highly sensitive and eager to please. So just watch for the risks there for them of being groomed by others or being pulled into social groups, which are perhaps not to their benefit, where they might be more easily manipulated because they're so desperate to have a chance to fit in. So doing some coaching around boundaries and assertiveness is really important. When you're thinking about ASD, those girls are really often socially motivated, but they may struggle with all the unspoken rules, and there's lots of those, and they kick in really early, again, with girls and maintaining friendships. So we often do a lot more work around social scripting and decoding, helping to understand those subtle cues, what's happening in shifting friendships. This can be particularly kicking in from like grade 4. Girls between grade 4 and grade 6, it's super dynamic social time. So just watching that, they need a safe place where they can like have permission to stim, retreat, unmask, whatever that might look like for them. But both at school and at home, there needs to be some place or like, and often maybe a safe word or something that they can use to let the adults in their life or the supports in their life know that the tank is full, that they need a chance to escape, and recognizing that capacity to self-regulate and self-advocate in those things would need to be directly taught. They're not going to pick that up, and that recognizing, I guess, being really tuned into the fact that them being quiet or compliant is not necessarily a good sign within that could be an indication of masking, and that can kind of go for a period of time and then the explosion comes. So you have to be, I guess, really tuned into those kind of underlying things for girls. I think those are kind of probably the key differences. Just that, yeah, as I said right at the beginning, to make sure we're really looking past the surface with girls and thinking about what might be happening for them. So the next question that was asked was in relation to a young person with ADHD relatively early on their kind of, I guess, journey in terms of understanding what that means for who they are as a human and how that might be impacting them, um, and substance use, or in this case, confirmed drug addiction. And unfortunately, the research will show us that young people with ADHD, particularly those if they have the hyperactivity type, are at significantly higher risk of developing a substance use disorder than the general population, than their peers. Some studies have shown that it's as high as 4 to 5 times more likely than their peers to kind of engage in heavy substance use, and that the lifetime risk, so once you move out of adolescence and you're getting into your adult years, is still as high as 69% are more likely to have a substance use disorder. So it is a very real risk if you're working with young people who have ADHD. It's really important for us to know that. And that's because there's a range of underlying factors, right? So part of that is built in is an impact to your frontal lobe and to your executive functioning. So that means you're inherently more likely to engage in risk taking. You're inherently more likely to be impulsive. So someone says, hey, you want to try this? And those internal mechanisms that might say to you, hey, wait, stop, have a think, don't kick in the same way. It's also true as the scenario referenced, that in some instances it's used as a coping mechanism, right? A way to quiet the brain if it's one that doesn't, ever slow down, or a way to perhaps socially lubricate if you find otherwise it's awkward to engage. There's a lot of reasons that can get there. There's the kind of constant restlessness that can be and the hyper sensory experiences that can be associated with ADHD can sometimes be calmed by using marijuana. And if you think about the fact that most ADHD medication in and of itself is a stimulant, because what you're trying to do is regulate the neural connections between the synapses, because they fire more irregularly, then stimulant drugs can actually ease that, and so make it feel like that you're functioning more effectively. And in fact, you might be functioning more effectively in the short term, though there's the longer term consequences of that. And on top of that, we also know there's much higher levels of anxiety and depression in kids who are neurologically diverse, because of that difference and that awareness of difference. So absolutely something for us to be aware of, absolutely something we should be trying to actively talk about. So I think, I'm a big fan of being honest with kids. And I think that actually saying your brain means that you are at greater risk of becoming addicted than the average person, that you are more likely to engage in these sorts of behaviors, and actually having that as an upfront conversation, um, depending on the young person, but knowledge is power, right? So that would be my instinct in that circumstance. And obviously things like the Child Mind Institute would have quite a lot of information on the relationship between ADHD and substance use, some of which is really important, or like not really important, but really geared towards actually using with the young people. So having kind of guiding your conversation with them so they understand that. I think, when you're talking, I guess as a a side note, when you're talking with a young person who is just started that diagnostic journey or just recently become diagnosed, it's really important that you lean into both the challenges that might present, but the superpowers. So, with ADHD, you can get that hyper focus and energy, and it's true for ASD as well, on an area of particular interest, and as a result, those people change the world, right? We know that the world is a better place because of some of the really hyper attention that people on the spectrum have brought, or people with ADHD are able to bring to their work. I think sometimes the intensive energy that they can bring into a space, and the ability to kind of keep going maybe when others can't. There are lots of things which I think are important for us to flag as positives for them. But it's, that's got to be a very, I guess, individualized kind of response, the kid and whether they can handle that sort of information or not. There are really great YouTube channels and on TikTok and other social media. I'm old, so I'm going to talk about YouTube, but I know they exist on the other things. But things like Mind Matters, which talks about teen substance use, has some specific things around um, substance use and neurodivergence, but there's also a whole ADHD and addiction. The link you can't ignore. There's as a kind of a UTP. So I'll send a few of those things through. But I often, do some looking yourself beforehand. But when I've been working with young people, I've used a lot of those sorts of videos as a way of eliciting conversation. Hey, let's watch a video together. Let's have a conversation about it. What parts of it do you relate to? What parts of it don't you relate to? It's also a really safe way for them to get information about their diagnosis from somebody else who has that diagnosis. And to be able to think about it. The main thing I'd say is make sure you're closing the loop. So if you know that they're looking, that you're paying attention, so that they don't kind of go down a rabbit hole all on their own, because of course that's one of the challenges of someone who's got ADHD. What are some simple tools that we can provide to families, caregivers who are wanting to start preparing a child with a disability to be ready for school when the time comes? So we're talking about really young children and those early stages of getting ready for school. It's so super important. And you've already taught, in the message you mentioned consistency, and that's really helpful. But one of the biggest ones is start setting up your morning routine, right? The getting up and out the door is one of the hardest bits for kids, and doing that in a vaguely reasonable way is actually a lot of skills. So working on a step-by-step picture guide or text that they have the skills to be able to read that shows the morning sequence of what needs to happen before they get out the door, and getting that in place beforehand, super helpful. Also, you could think about, if that's a challenge for them, because if you're working with a kid who maybe loses the sequence or loses the steps, you can have a reinforcement program in place and really get it so that that routine is established. It happens Monday to Friday, even when there's not school happening. And one of the other things I would always recommend is, often with those kids, keep it going even during the school holidays. We're all feeling like we need a break, but actually, often for those kids, it's more important to keep the rhythm and routine going. Even thinking about again, those sensory needs. Is it a child whose system is really up, and so they need us to help them come down before? So you're building into that routine something calming, like at the end, once we finish all this, we snuggle in a beanbag and we read a couple pages of a book, or I get to lie with my weighted blanket and watch one little show on television before we walk out the door, or they're the opposite way around. And before we hit the door, we have to jump on the trampoline for 10 big jumps. So build those things into the routine that you think will help them in that regulation engagement before they go out the door. And obviously they're doing it with you. So it's that co-regulation, which we know is so important, particularly when you have the trauma overlay as well. Starting to teach them language about feelings, language about emotions can be really helpful. That can be super simple, like just a smiley face and you're pointing at it, or you can have one of those more complex emotion charts. First, just learning what they are, using lots of the picture books that exist out there to get really familiar with emotional language. But the intention there is also then to start them identifying, what does an emotion look like in another person? What does an emotion look like in me? That can be super helpful when you're suddenly in a classroom setting and there's all those emotions around you. It also might be a way to then, if you can link that emotion to activity in time, it might give the teacher a trick that they can use to go, when I'm feeling, then I do this. When I'm feeling this, I can do that, etc. The zones of regulation are really good that way. You can do simple versions of that early on. And a lot of schools are familiar with it, so it becomes something that can translate to that for them. If you've got a kid who's highly anxious when they're going new places, thinking about having like some form of transition object that they can have with them. For my son, who's not neurodivergent but does have very high anxiety, I had a turtle necklace. He loved turtles, and that was the thing that he wore. So he used to wear his turtle necklace underneath his shirt. so that he felt like he had that security with him, and that was kind of his transition object. He was I guess, a tangible representation of safety. And we introduced that preschool so that he then had that, and then just one day stopped wearing it. And I got my necklace back. Um, how you end the day is equally important. So I guess starting to think about those bedtime routines and things like that, if you can, and what can be done the day before so it doesn't have to be part of the rush in the morning, and building that into their routine is really useful. Um, and if you're working, I guess lastly, like any sort of co-regulation activities, whatever it might be, breathing together, um, being able to sit and listen to music with somebody else or something, so that they have those skills that they could draw on when they're in school. All that would be useful. um, and the sophisticated, as they get older, you'd make them more sophisticated as you're going along. And the last questions were all of a theme. That's probably the best way to put it. It was really clear that one of the biggest challenges that you as a collective group are working with schools. In fact, 75% of all the questions that came through reference school in some form or another. So let me start by saying I hear you. It genuinely, the challenges that you're facing, they're real. It can be incredibly frustrating when you feel like a school is not being responsive, or even worse, that they're penalizing a young person because of their disability. And obviously, you're going into this knowing not only does this young person have a disability, but they have a significant history of trauma that has already disadvantaged them. And so our desire to advocate is really strong, and it should be. Um, and unfortunately, the schools that are really nailing it are in the minority. That's my experience from when I was a clinician. I really struggled at times to work with schools, sometimes even hard just to get into the school, to be able to have those conversations. Um, and, I think that actually, surprisingly, some of the ones that find it hardest to be responsive and maybe more adaptive in the way they respond are special schools. So I've often found actually small public schools are sometimes the best, or the Catholic schools, sometimes small Catholic schools, but it's hit or miss. It's really dependent on the principal and the principal's view of disability and where they see their role. But regardless of whether they're special schools or mainstream schools or private schools, there are heaps of things that they can and arguably should be doing. But, and yes, I am bringing a but into this, because if you remember going back all the way to the first time that I was invited to come and have a chat with you guys, I talked about PBS, so the Positive Behavior Support Framework. We talked about it then as the kind of guiding framework to help us understand the behavior of a young person, to understand the message lying behind it, or the function, as we talk about. But that theory, that methodology, can be applied not just to individuals, but can be applied to organizations and to systems. And in this instance, I'm going to be suggesting we apply it to schools, because there's a whole lot of stuff going on for schools right now in this space. So the first thing, at the macro level, the NDIS has not helped. So it's really served as like a get out of jail free card for a lot of other sectors: education, housing, health. For the big ones, have kind of left them off the hook. And it's become what it was never meant to be, which is the catch-all for everything, which, has worked for some people who've been on the scheme. Of course, enhances the disadvantage for people with disability who are not on the scheme, but it's also actually left massive gaps where the NDIS is saying that's actually not about their disability supports, or that's not the way, that's not eligible for NDIS services. So this is where we hope foundational supports will come into play. But given the political climate and things, I'm not looking for that to solve our problems anytime in the near future. The next thing I guess I would say is, don't forget that we're coming in talking about the kid, the one that's kind of front and center for us. But remember the complexity of what they're juggling in the classroom. A study last year found that 25.7% of all children, our students are receiving some form of educational adjustment. That's just over a quarter of all students are receiving an educational adjustment. That means the need is so great that they have been diagnosed or assessed as requiring adjustment. So in a classroom of the average size, which is 24, you've got 6 kids with additional needs, formally assessed additional needs. That's not including Susie's, whose parents are going through a really difficult separation and where she's bouncing back and forth and hearing the argument and the impact that's having, or Pete, whose mom has just been diagnosed with breast cancer, or George, whose family's just been made homeless and they're kind of bouncing around, right? Like, these teachers are being asked to be so incredibly individualized in their approach across an increasingly complex cohort. And the average program for teaching, though it requires some element of inclusive education to be included, in many instances, you're talking about 30 minutes or less across their total program. Sometimes they've had a course, sometimes they've had a lecture, but actually most teachers are coming into this without having those skills necessarily, but being asked increasingly to be able to modify specifically for academic, social, emotional, and behavioral challenges. So I just think it's important for us to remember it can be really difficult to juggle the needs of 2, 3, 4, 5 kids in, say, a residential setting or in our home setting if we've got 2 or 3 kids. Doing that at scale is really difficult. So just keep that in mind. And I say that because it means that when we're advocating from a place of respect and empathy. And I think that's really key. And I also think that teachers, and I am one, I have been one, are generally under siege at the moment. Really, schools are simultaneously being asked to are held to account to fix everything from academics to youth violence to gender violence to youth mental health issues, but simultaneously being told that they're not professional and that they can't make those decisions on their own. So the government and families and everyone else is going to set what the curriculum should be and how they should be implementing that. And that is a really tricky space to be in. And I think particularly parents' level of expectation and level of both expectation about what's going to happen for their child, but also the level of control that they should have within the classroom has increased, probably to a level that's not helpful. I'm hoping the pendulum will swing back, but at the moment we're in a situation where parents really feel entitled to manage that. And unfortunately, that brings a whole lot of NIMBY. What we've had in our housing is now in our schools, which is like, yes, I want you to support the child with a disability, but not in my kid's classroom. Right. So they are in the principal's ears after the first incident. They are relying on social media and putting a huge amount of pressure. This isn't me justifying. It's not right. It shouldn't happen. You're 100% talking about yet another way in which people with disability are having their rights violated. But I think it's really important that we understand that's what teachers are coping with. I think it's about being cognizant about how we use that information to help us partner, so that we're really coming in from more of a how can we help approach. And I'm sure you're doing that. But I guess recognizing when we get the pushback and the resistance that that's what's there. And sometimes we can even name that, and then think about, like, from that naming, try to figure out how we can work more in partnership with them. And sometimes, before I get into some of the explicit things that you've spoken about, sometimes the best thing we can do is manage the stuff that's in our control. So it is really thinking about, are we doing everything to fill the cup, to regulate the kid, to make sure that they are as set up for school as humanly possible in the morning, giving them extra movement if that's what they need to kind of regulate their system. Being super structured around kind of making sure they're organized for when they're going in, and also thinking about how we're reducing demands, expectations, et cetera, when they come home, and really thinking about, again, filling that cup from a sensory standpoint. I often think, like, if we can get school to be the place where they feel like they work to hold it together, because we don't ask them to hold it together outside, that's ideal for them. It's much, much harder for us. So you just need to, I guess, think about that. things you can't even think about using some form of reinforcement program to help a kid. Hey, if you can kind of get through this part of the day or whatever, then these are going to be you're earning tokens towards or whatever. And your education consultants can sometimes help with that, or you can reach out to your Learning Without Barriers team, and they might be able to help with that. But that's, I guess, broadly speaking, stuff to be considering. Oh, all the things that you shared about kids who are being kept out of the school system. And I would say, generally, there was one question about, is that generally something that's useful? And the short answer is rarely. Long term, absolutely not. It's a restrictive practice. Um, it can be used as a circuit breaker. And in certain circumstances, it's the circuit breaker that everybody needs to have a breath and a rest. And that might be the teacher that needs that. It might be the other kids in the classroom that needs that. But once it becomes like a default mechanism, once it becomes a pattern or the only bag, only trick in the bag, then it's not actually serving any purpose. It's not allowing the work to happen. And often, when you think about the spectrum of things that we do, are from our proactive strategies, which can take a long time to come into place, through to those reactive strategies, which are about how do we manage this problem in the moment, including the use of those like more intensive restrictive interventions. That pointy end can serve a purpose, right? But often the purpose is to let us do the work, right? So if it's not letting the school do the work and us do the work to enable more effective engagement, then it's actually not serving a purpose, and it's just being punitive for punitive sake. And that we really should be, I guess, conceptually challenging. So the first scenario was about a 12-year-old in year 6 who's only had partial attendance of about an hour to an hour and a half a day for over 2 years. Really appreciate the advocacy that you're bringing for this young person. It's really clear. Your frustration is clear. The resistance from the school system is clear. Unfortunately, New South Wales education does rely, and we do see this in other states too, but does rely really heavily on exclusion as a way of managing behavior for young people with a disability. I guess my keys would be when they say things like, and I saw that a couple others use this phrase, their behaviors need to improve. That is such a generic statement. Hone in on that. What does improve look like? Give me something specific and measurable. Does improve mean that you're expecting him to sit in his seat for a specific period of time? Does improve look like the use of emotional regulation skills in a specific setting? I think one of the things that can be is the comments will be really global and they're expecting improvement across the board, kind of broad sweeping. And that's actually not possible for any child. You can bring that down. Like you wouldn't expect a child who couldn't read to go from I don't know my letters to I'm reading a novel without intervention. You would scaffold that. The same is true for behavior. So really trying to get specific about that can help that conversation. And being really clear then about documenting what's the link between improvement and attendance. So if we're using saying sitting in a seat, I'm sure it's not that, but let's say it was that. Well, if at the moment he's only sitting in the seat for 30 seconds, and so for 30 seconds we can only cope with that for an hour and a half. If he gets to 10 minutes, what does that look like? And really trying to get some details so that you have something you're actually working towards. What's the kid working towards? Improvement isn't concrete enough for any child with a neurodivergent. So let's make that concrete. I also want to just be really careful about behaviors are to do with diagnosis. Behaviors will have the diagnosis as a background to them. They may shape some context, but the behavior is going to be because the environment is not suitable for the kid's diagnosis. So just watch how that language can come in and just I often talk about how do we make this an enabling environment, right? So at the moment, the environment's not enabling the child to participate in the most effective way. What could we be doing to make this a more enabling environment? So it might be looking at what those specific skills are that he needs or what things they need to be doing to change that environment. Clearly, routine is key. I agree with you 100%. You're right on the money that at the moment, they're using behavior to escape from something that they don't understand or that's not positive for them is so strongly reinforced that they're going to be defaulting to that all the time. And there does need to be some level of commitment from the school that that's actually the thing you're trying to break through. Sometimes getting a behavior specialist to come to the table for that to help with those conversations can help, but not always. Also, again, relying on the educational consultants in the area to see if they can assist in that circumstance. I'm going to move these relatively quickly because I think I was supposed to only go for 20 minutes and I've definitely gone longer than that. But hopefully, like Megan's been able to break some magic so all this makes some sense for you guys. But the next scenario was around a 9-year-old who seems to really like kind of going to school, and has a really good support system there. But when things become too much and he isn't feeling safe, he runs away, and there's a problem because he doesn't have road rules kind of knowledge, and there's a road nearby. And obviously, when he's heightened, he's not paying attention to that stuff. So the one thought that I had there, I guess, would be to think about, is there a way to create a safe space away from the school, but on the grounds that's like his and just his? And could he be involved in the creation of that? Or is there something in the school that they'd be willing to sacrifice, a closet or something that could be turned into a place for him and where he could be reinforced for going? And obviously you'd start that by him going there when he wasn't that high elevated. They'd have to be taking, kind of supporting him to go there and making it fun and making it cool. But then maybe that behavior could be shaped so that he was still escaping to a safe place. He could still get away while he was learning those kind of greater skills, but that it was keeping him within the confines of the school gate. If they are agile and flexible, they might be willing to play around with that. The key would be for him to be actively involved in the design, and to, if he has an OT involved, to make sure that wherever it is that's created for him really ticks some of those sensory boxes. So what he's going to will kind of meet those sensory needs so that he can go there and not necessarily consciously, it can be a completely unconscious process, but kind of do some regulation to get himself back to baseline. There were also lots of questions. I guess the last thing I'll kind of bring them together was talking about how you share your knowledge, right? And that's a really tricky thing, right? I think this is, I guess, going back to what I talked about before, where schools probably feel right now that they have subject matter experts coming in all the time and sharing their knowledge. And that's both really helpful. And if you're really comfortable and confident in your space, it's great, but it can also be can be threatening. So I guess really thinking about how you're sharing that information and doing, starting everything with those affirmations, just like we actually do with kids. So really appreciating what they're doing in terms of maybe the physical supports they're putting in place, but this was particularly leaning in, trying to help them understand how important the relational environment is. And I think building that knowledge base can be really helpful. There are tip sheets and things like that I could give you. But, I think it is just a gradual conversation, right? You're shifting someone's mindset. And it's harder for anybody to change their behavior than it is to change the environment. We see that with kids too, right? And the reason we rely often on our antecedent controls first and foremost is because that's in our control versus learning new skills, learning new ways of responding to things which are in their control and can take longer. So again, same thinking has to come in with working with teachers. But it is losing those lines. When a student doesn't feel emotionally safe or connected, their brain's not going to be available to learn or use even the great things that you've set up, even with all the right tools in place. They actually need support to be able to do that. And reminding them that safety is not about an environment, it's about people. These things, but I think it's being, I guess, persistent and consistent in your language, thinking about how you might set up one-page profiles for kids and maybe make sure all that relational stuff's at the top. So that's the most important thing. So you can almost say, once you get this all in place, if additional things are needed, here's some environmental changes that can help. And having something like that you're constantly updating from your place of knowledge and sharing with the school practical things they can do. So you're not kind of giving them concepts, but you're giving them the practical steps so they don't have to think about it because they've got those 24 kids they're thinking about, can be really useful. But the other thing I guess I was thinking, and as I was reading those, was it's your collective knowledge that actually might have impact. And I wonder whether or not there is a really simple way to bring together some of these stories. In an impactful presentation that could be used with schools so that they recognize that actually what we're trying to tackle here is something that's more systemic. So perhaps Michelle and Dale, I'd be laying that as a kind of thing for you guys to think about, as well as what we do for the kids who fully disengage. What can we be doing to help schools really think about their engagement with these kids differently, so kids stay engaged? So I think that's probably enough for me today. It's a lot to sit and listen to someone who's not just on a screen and you can't interact. So I want to thank you for inviting me back. Apologize again that I'm having to send this through as a recording. I really hope that I hit the majority of your questions. There absolutely are some there I didn't get to, and some specific things around resources. I might see if I can send some of that through. And alternatively, I'm pretty sure we've already got a time booked for later in this year. So if there are things that you'd like me to dig into a little bit more deeply, I'm certainly more than happy to do that. Just make sure that Megan and Michelle know. But anyways, I'll say a huge thank you for letting me come and crash in this way. And I hope that each of you found one or two things that might be useful moving forward. Take care. Until next time.